Good morning. It is leg day, and I told Marilyn, if I can walk back into the house when I get back, send me back to the gym. No, I don't work out like that anymore. Don't do that no more. Actually, that was not good. But anyway, I used to work out like that. But anyway, we're going to chatter a little bit. Maybe a few people will hop on. I want to talk to you about generational curses, spoken curses, familiar spirits, generational unclean spirits. But the big thing is generational curses. You know, the Bible emphatically says that a child cannot be held responsible for their parents' sin in one scripture. And then it talks about in another scripture passing the generational iniquity on to 4 or 5 generations, 3 or 4, Exodus 25. So those seemingly oppose each other. In other words, somehow we have got to figure out a way to take those seemingly opposing ideas found in Scripture and reconcile them in one idea. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, just please share this so some people can get the beginning. Go back and watch it from the beginning so you get all the information. Because generational curses are real. You know, in the opening and the introduction of The Unaddicted, that's where we talk about how our sin pattern seems to follow the sin patterns of our parents and grandparents. We often meet with people who are 3 or 4, even 5 generations deep into addiction. Now, your grandfather's alcohol addiction becomes your dad's cocaine and pot addiction, and now we got ice and fentanyl because sin is both progressive and aggressive. In other words, it escalates quickly into getting worse and worse and worse. The same way with sexual sin. We used to have sex outside of the sanctity of marriage, then it evolved in the late 60s with the sexual revolution, and then the free lovey-dovey community, and then it evolved into acceptance of homosexual activity, and now we have what? We have 70 plus genders. So we see how sin, so my dad's sin, my grandfather's sin is exemplified. It grows in severity from generation to generation. But the basis of the sin is same. We got lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. And then if you want to see the subcategories, we see the 17 works of the flesh. But, so as we see that, but why am I held guilty of my father's sin? Why am I held responsible for my father's sin? You know, you have to engage in sin before you're held responsible. But we are all born sinners. We're born without the ability to process sin outside of the grace of God. Does that make sense? So without the grace of God in my life, it is impossible for me to forgive. So we know in our time in the deliverance ministry that a big issue that causes demonization is unforgiveness. Now, God never asks you to associate or to go back into a toxic relationship calling that forgiveness. Don't get me mixed up. But say I'm 4 or 5 and I'm abused. Without coming to know God and without the grace of God, that abuse will emphatically turn into unforgiveness, bitterness, and lead to a plethora of all kind of sins. So what happened is the iniquity also, the propensity toward that particular sin, plus the trauma that I don't process. You know, if I get saved and process the trauma, then the demonization never takes place. But if I don't come to know God, and I begin to try to emotionally process it, which that's part of it, but the emotional process must be done spiritually. And when I don't do that, what happens? Well, then I begin to build a stronghold, and the stronghold gets big enough to where the demons can actually move in and gain access. So that gives you an idea of how generational sin, we become responsible for our father's sin. We're not responsible for our father's sin. We're responsible for our sin, but our inability to process them outside of the grace of God leads us to unforgiveness, which leads us to bitterness, which leads us to anger, and then leads us to opening a foothold to the devil. Why do we've got to label all of these spirits? The scorpion spirit, the octopus spirit, the marine spirit, the Leviathan spirit, the Jezebel spirit, the Ahab spirit, the frog spirit. I don't know. That stuff just weirds me out. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't like it, but I got a word from the Lord the other day, about someone that said they was struggling with a black widow type spirit. And then I began to think about how the black widow spirit and the Jezebel spirit would be somewhat interchangeable, but a little bit different. Because what does a black widow do? She seduces men and then kills them. She seduces her mate and then kills them. The Lord told me, he said, if you'll look at how these animals are, Jezebel acted in the natural realm, you'll see how these spirits operate in the spiritual realm. So do I need to be calling out the Leviathan spirit? I don't know, man. I ain't got all that quite figured out yet. But I do know there is a constricting spirit, and I've watched it grip people on the back, and even watched a scratch appear on a lady's back last week, where the Leviathan just constricts and holds and gets a person in bondage. So those are my 2 thoughts for today. How generational iniquity leads to generational curses. There really is no generational curse. We have to, that we're not responsible for. The curse is actually our propensity toward a particular sin, and then our inability to forgive the people that hurt us, that leads to demonization. Anyway, God bless y'all. I love you. Hope you have a good day.